Oh, hello there. Eber here with Hardware Connects, and this is the 2018 LG Gram Ultrabook. And this is by far the lightest 15-inch notebook that I've ever held in my hands. I mean, I'm not kidding. This is a pretty lightweight notebook. And one of the things that LG has done here is, I mean, it's nothing major. I mean, they've done a few design shifts, which we'll get to shortly, but they've updated the internal hardware. So this time it's running the newer Kaby Lake R 8th generation U-series processor. And this particular model that I have over here is spec'd out. It costs $2,000, so definitely it is an expensive or premium notebook or premium price that you're going to be paying for a notebook like this. So let's find out how well it performs and what it's like using the LG Gram right after this.
Finally, an ultra-slim body keyboard with mechanical red or blue switches designed and perfected for work and play. The Tesoro Gram XS evolved to fit right in. Check it out below.
Okay, so as always, let's start with the build quality and design. So LG hasn't made any major changes in this department with the 2018 model. The main chassis still features the same premium nanocarbon magnesium body, and while they've claimed military-grade certification on their official website, I can't scientifically validate them. But here's the thing. When you decide to pick up the LG Gram notebook, the first thing that you would notice is just how lightweight it is, and that's thanks to the magnesium alloy construction that they've done here. The problem is that it doesn't feel as robust or premium as some of the other Ultrabooks that I've taken a look at. For example, the HP Spectre NV360 and the Dell XPS 13. Those notebooks are built like tanks. I mean, it comes with an aluminum unibody construction. It feels a lot more solid in the hand, and you can easily toss them in your backpack, and you wouldn't have to worry about just long-term durability. That's something that that's something that's questionable with the LG Gram, because I do remember with last year's model, my screen for some reason, this was just, throughout usage, the screen for some reason just didn't show up. I mean, half of it was completely like glitched out, and the other half it kind of worked. So I think it has to do with obviously the way how you handle it over time. So I'd highly recommend getting a sleeve when you decide to pick up the Gram, and I'd be extra careful or cautious when handling the Gram notebook. The screen does exhibit a lot of flex, and I'm not even going as far as I can in terms of force with that, and it's definitely something to keep in mind. I wouldn't, easily toss in your backpack. I'd be, again, very cautious. That's something that I want to reiterate with the handling part of the Gram notebook. Now, a couple things worth mentioning is that the previous LG logo used to be at the top right-hand side. This time they've eliminated that and replaced it with the Gram to emphasize the notebook, and it's at the center. I like that. The webcam has also been shifted from the bottom to the top, so you don't have to worry about pointing it at your nose. LG did manage to make a little bit of room at the top bezel, but realistically, you're not going to notice a huge difference while staring at the screen. Speaking of the screen, the Gram features a 15.6-inch 1080p IPS display with minimal bezels, of course, so just like the previous generation. And I think the whole bezel-less approach is an expectation in Ultrabooks these days, because we saw them implement last year with the Gram, the XPS, and a few of the Ultrabooks, and we're slowly starting to see them in gaming notebooks. So the Gigabyte Aero 15X is an example. MSI just came out with their recent Stealth notebook with bezel-less design. So it is an expectation. And once you go bezel-less, it's really hard to come back, because the good advantage of that is you're not losing a lot in terms of screen resolution. You're getting the exact same screen real estate, but in a relatively compact form factor. And that's awesome. The display by itself is pretty good. The viewing angles are great, and that's expected given the IPS technology. The one thing that I did notice is that the contrast ratio is a lot better and balanced compared to last year's model, so the whites are not blown out, and that's a welcoming change. But I did wish if the screen could get a little brighter, as it was a little difficult to view outdoors. Needless to say, this is a great panel to view content on, and you can definitely get away with some light content creation. So if you want to use Photoshop, I think you wouldn't have a problem at all. Do note that this is a touchscreen display, and there is a significant amount of wobble while interacting with the screen, so I'd recommend staying away from using that. Plus, the screen is glossy, so expect a ton of fingerprints over time while handling. Taking a look at the ports, on the right you get a Kensington lock, 2 USB 3.0 ports, a headphone jack, and once again, we see a micro SD card reader. Honestly, I'm not really sure how I can comment on this implementation, because on the previous Gram, review, I did mention that that was a terrible implementation in my opinion. I mean, a lot of people prefer full-size SD card readers, especially if you're a content creator. Most cameras these days accept full-size SD cards, so not having that full-size SD card slot on an Ultrabook is a disappointment. I mean, they do have the room to implement that. It's just that they decided to go with something that not a lot of people use. I mean, let me know in the comments down below. Would you have preferred a micro SD card slot or a full-size SD card reader on the Gram Notebook, or just Ultrabooks in general? Love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Switching over to the left, there is power in, an extra USB 3.0 port, a full-size HDMI port, and a USB Type-C port, which thankfully this time supports Thunderbolt 3, so you could take advantage of plugging in an external GPU. But I'll leave a link to Dave 2D's video in the description down below where he walks you through his experience plugging in an external GPU to the notebook, and he experienced some performance issues with that, so it's something that you should look into. You can also use the Type-C port to charge the notebook, but unfortunately LG does not include a USB Type-C charger, but rather you have to use the dedicated port and this included power adapter, which surprisingly is lightweight, so you can easily toss this in your backpack. It's super compact, which is great, but it would have been a lot nicer to include a Type-C charger. I should also mention that the 14-inch version of the Gram Notebook does not support Thunderbolt 3, but rather it supports the USB 3.0 protocol, so that's something to keep in mind. Oh, and LG gets bonus points for including a USB Type-C to RJ45 LAN port adapter, so I'm sure that will come in handy during travel. The Gram 15 features a full-size keyboard, including a numpad, which could be useful if you work with a lot of numbers, and the keys exhibit good tactile feedback with pretty good amount of travel distance, so typing in general was a pleasant experience. I will say, however, that the keys found on the HP Spectre X360 are a little bit better in terms of tactility, but that's just a personal thing. The power button also acts as a fingerprint reader, and it's a nice and subtle implementation, quick and easy to unlock the device, so that's a nice feature. They've also made the keyboard backlit with two-step brightness adjustments, similar to last year's model. The trackpad has also improved a lot compared to last year because LG made the right choice to go with Windows Precision drivers over those crappy Elan and Synaptics drivers, so you'll get the best experience with gesture control, and the surface is really smooth for finger navigation. The primary left and right buttons are integrated at the bottom. They are a little bit on the mushier side. I'm not typically a fan of integrated buttons, I prefer them dedicated, but that's just, again, personal preference. The speakers are located at the bottom, so they are downwards firing. If you're listening to a lot of music that's heavily emphasized on vocals, you're not going to be getting the best experience because as soon as you place it on your desk, the vocals just gets muffled out. You're going to be listening to a lot of bass. I think the bass will sort of overpower that. I wish they implemented some sort of front-facing speakers so that it's more directional, so you can actually get a good experience out of it. But needless to say, they are pretty good. It's just not as good as something like the HP Spectre X360 because the speakers on those were incredible. All right, so let's get into the internals of this notebook. So as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, this particular laptop is loaded with specs. I mean, it's a $2,000 notebook, so it comes with a Core i7-8550U quad-core processor. It comes with a base clock of 1.8 gigahertz with a boost up to 4 gigahertz. It comes with 16 gigabytes of RAM, clocked at 2400 megahertz. In terms of storage, this notebook comes with two 512 gigabyte SATA-based M.2 SSDs for a total of 1 terabyte. And that's an interesting choice because most Ultrabooks, specifically the competition, they offer NVMe solutions. So if you're looking for the fastest read and write performance, that's something that you should look into because this, as you can see, the read and write speeds average between 450 to 550 megabytes per second, which isn't terrible, by the way, because from my day-to-day usage, just browsing the web, opening up applications, it was speedy and I didn't have any problems on that department. But if you are looking for the fastest read and write performance, this notebook isn't up for you. Another thing worth mentioning is that accessing the internals of the notebook was quite challenging and it required the removal of the adhesive rubber feet, which was of no good use after, so keep note of that. The good news is that once you get in, both the SSDs and the RAM modules can be used or replaced, but it isn't recommended by LG. So with all of that out of the way, how does this notebook perform? Well, just as expected, it's right on par with the rest of the Ultrabooks featuring the 8th Gen i7 CPUs. Cinebench R15 running the CPU test yielded a little shy of 550 points. Switching to OpenGL, we get around 51 frames per second thanks to the decent integrated UHD graphics. Real-world tests like Handbrake, Luxmark, and GIMP perform just as good as the XPS 13 that I tested a while back featuring an 8th Gen Core i7 CPU. Remember guys, these quad-core hyper-threaded processors are nothing shy of amazing. They're an excellent upgrade for multitasking scenarios. Now, I wouldn't recommend intense video editing on the LG Gram since the lack of a dedicated GPU severely affects render times. Casual 1080p edits are okay, but I decided to stretch the CPU's performance anyways by rendering a 1-minute 4K video, and as you can see, the system took a little over 12 minutes to complete the task. Definitely way over that 1-to-1 ratio. What about gaming? Well, remember, this is an Ultrabook after all, so I would keep your expectations low because the integrated UHD graphics is not that great. Overwatch set to 1080p at low dished out roughly 60 frames per second, which is pretty comfortable, but if you throw in demanding titles like Battlefield 1 or Fortnite, you're not going to expect those exact same frame rates at that resolution. The thermal performance on the Grand Notebook was a little disappointing, so during my AIDA64 stress FPU test, I noticed that the CPU temperatures were hitting as far as 81C, but it did experience throttling. So clock speeds were hitting as far as 2 GHz, which shouldn't be the case because the turbo spec on this particular CPU should reach as far as 2 GHz on all 4 cores, but that was not the case. But remember, this is under a full 100% workload. So if your application takes advantage of 4 cores and if the utilization is around 85 to 90%, you can definitely expect clock speeds a little bit higher. And of course, during idle tasks like browsing the web or watching videos, you can definitely see those clock speeds head as far as 4 GHz. So definitely keep this in mind. It is unfortunate that LG decided to go with a single fan solution to cool both the CPU and the integrated GPU. I would have preferred a dual fan setup just like some other notebooks, but it is what we get. Battery life on the LG Gram Notebook was excellent. In fact, I did manage to put this up against the HP Spectre X360 and the XPS 13 featuring 8th-gen CPUs. One thing to note is that both those laptops feature 60 watt-hour batteries compared to 72 watt-hours on the Gram Notebook. So expect around 11 hours under light load use, and our test involved refreshing a web page in Chrome for 15 seconds until it completely depleted the battery. Under heavy load, which involves real bench running on a loop, this notebook lasted for around 3 hours, so it's right on par with the XPS and the HP notebooks, which is pretty good. So definitely expect good battery life out of the LG Gram Notebook. You wouldn't have any problem taking it or just using this notebook throughout the day. And so this brings us to the conclusion. The Gram 15 by LG is by far the lightest 15-inch Ultrabook that I've ever held in my hand. And this is an interesting laptop because, for one, we're typically used to seeing 13 to 14-inch Ultrabooks sort of, go around the market, but a 15-inch Ultrabook is definitely interesting. And if you're someone who's looking into getting an Ultrabook with a slightly larger screen, I think the 15-inch is a pretty good option, but there are a few things to keep in mind. One, the build quality. You have to be really cautious while handling this because, as you can see, the screen, it flexes. I can't really guarantee you the best longevity out of this because I personally have to test it myself. And the other thing is thermal performance. If you're planning on running heavier tasks, like for example, if your application particularly uses all 4 cores at 100% load, well, you're definitely going to notice CPU throttling, and that's unfortunate. And the other thing is, if you decide to plug in an external GPU, and like Dave mentioned in his video, you're not going to be getting the best performance out of it, and obviously that's due to the thermal limitation. On the positive side, they've improved the trackpad, the keyboard is nice and tactile. I wish that the display was a little brighter, but it's still great. It's an IPS panel, viewing angles are great. But for $2,000, I was expecting a little bit more. That's just my personal opinion, because I wouldn't spend $2,000 on a notebook like this, especially when you decide to load it up with specs. You can definitely pick up the 14-inch variant for a lot cheaper, but you are sacrificing a little bit on that because you would obviously lose the Thunderbolt 3 support with the USB Type-C and a few more. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the LG Gram Notebook, specifically this 15-inch model. Would you be willing to spend $2,000 on an Ultrabook? Or are you much better off picking a gaming laptop at that price point? Let me know in the comments down below. I'm Ibra with Hardware Connects. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.